So I'm going to make apologies to people on YouTube. I thought I had recorded the first section of class, only when it came to our break time to find out that apparently I hadn't pushed the record button. So we're picking up here with Genesis 39, beginning with verse 7. So you've missed chapter 38, and you've missed 39, 1 through 6. And perhaps at a future time, I'll be able to record that and put it up online for you guys who want that. So whose turn to read chapter 39, 7 through 10?
And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to leave.
Okay, so the last line of verse 6 sort of leads us into what happens in the following verses. We were told now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So we weren't just being told that so that we could know Joseph's a good-looking guy, but it sets up this next scene. There's only one other person in Scripture who is described as handsome in form and appearance. Want to take a guess? Not Absalom. Not Saul. No? Stay in Genesis. How about Joseph's mom? Rachel. Okay? She's the only other one described exactly this way. So he inherited his looks from his mom, okay? And we read in verse 7, some trouble develops for Joseph because of his good looks. The New King James says his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And in Hebrew, she says 2 words, lie with me. 3 in English, but 2 in Hebrew. So real short and quick to the point. No flirting around. After all, she's in charge. And so she issues the order, lie with me. But Joseph, to his credit, refuses. And listen to what he says here in verse 8. Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. So we've been talking about the significance of this word hand and how Joseph has a faithful hand. And this is why his master trusts him with so much authority in the house. And this is his first response back to her. Look, your husband trusts me, and he's giving me all this authority. What other reasons does Joseph list? There's 3 total that he gives.
Would be a sin against God.
Yes, okay, it'd be a sin against God. That's actually the 3rd reason, and then there's one before that. It's an obvious one.
She's his master's wife.
Sorry?
She's his master's wife.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be an offense against her husband, and it would be a great sin against God. So Joseph gives 3 reasons. This takes a lot on Joseph's part to refuse the master's wife. Granted, he'd be in a lot more trouble if the master finds out that he did it, but nonetheless, she wields the second most authoritative position in the house. And to refuse her is dangerous, but it just puts him in an impossible situation. He obviously can't agree, but so many would. And this is where we see Joseph's integrity in the whole thing. And then verse 10 makes it worse because we're told that she spoke to Joseph day by day. So every day he's having to deal with this. And remember, he's in the house. He's not a field servant. So he is constantly seeing her while he's serving in the house. Okay, any other thoughts in verses 7 through 10? Yeah.
Why don't you think he brought it up with Potiphar himself?
Well, we might do that these days, but in the ancient world, a servant would not really be in a position to tell his master, hey, your wife's hitting on me, you know? So.
Unlike, she could just be not out, and that would go against his.
And then it would go against Joseph, yeah.
So really no-win situation.
So yeah, for him, it's a no-win situation. Since she presses it here, as we see in the next verses, she keeps on keeping on. So yeah, impossible situation for Joseph. So let's go ahead and read 11 through 20.
One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained.
Okay. So, the unfortunate situation of being caught alone in the house one day in verse 11, no doubt this was the kind of opportunity that she was waiting for. Verse 12, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me," but he left his garment in her hand. Notice that use of hand again. So we said, as we were looking at verses 1 through 6, there's a contrast here between the hands of Joseph and the hands of Potiphar's wife. Joseph has faithful hands. And what do those hands look like? They look like this. They're hands that are willing to receive whatever is put into them and to be faithful then in caring for those things. He doesn't demand anything. He doesn't take anything. He just receives what's put in his hands, and he's faithful to discharge his duties. Potiphar's wife, on the other hand, has a taking hand, a grasping hand. Okay, so this is a very significant difference that shows the integrity of Joseph. And later on in the Bible, we see this same contrast. For instance, David is shown to have hands that receive what God wants to give him. And he's blessed and he does great until he decides to take something for himself, which is Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. So I think there's a big lesson here for us to ask ourselves, what kind of hands do we have? Do we feel like we have certain rights and we deserve certain things, and if we don't get them, we're going to take them? We're going to do whatever it takes to get that thing? Or are we going to trust God and say, I'm in this situation now. I believe that God is with me, that he's watching over me. And so I'm not going to force something to happen. I'm going to receive with grace what he's given me and trust him to bless me through it. And that's exactly what he does for Joseph. We're told a number of times how God blessed all that was in his hands. I'm sure Joseph's first choice wasn't to be a slave in Egypt. And yet, because he graciously accepted where God had him, God was able to bless him and use that situation. Joseph actually becomes a witness to Potiphar and the whole household through his integrity and the way God blesses. So we have 3 different versions of this story. Did you realize that as we read these verses? The first version we have called the narrator's version, or the author's version, which we know is the true version. And that's the one that we read about in verses 11 and 12 and 13. But she tells the story 2 more times. Who does she tell the story to?
The other servants and husband.
Okay, so she first tells it to the other servants, and then secondly, she tells it to her husband. And one of the interesting things to do in the Bible, when you have a situation like this where you're told a story, and then you listen to the character repeat the story, compare the 2 versions and see if they're the same or if there are maybe significant changes that have happened. And then that tells you something about the person who is relating the story. So in verse 14, when she's talking to the other servants, she says, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. So he's brought a man, a Hebrew, to mock us. Tell me about what you see in these words.
Well, she brings her husband into it. Like Joseph's acting against him.
Yeah.
Specifically.
She actually kind of blames her husband for bringing Joseph in to the house. It's his fault, right? Kind of putting herself on the side of the servants against the master of the household. Good. What else?
The Jesus being held in low regard.
Say again, sorry?
The Jesus being held in low regard.
Yeah, okay. So what she's doing here, she's pulling the race card. She's an Egyptian, right? He's brought a Hebrew in to mock us. So the other servants must be Egyptian. And so she's saying, couldn't we have expected this? Couldn't we anticipate you bring a Hebrew into the household? This is the sort of stuff that's going to go on. You can't trust those Hebrews. You know, the race card isn't something new that people use these days. It is being used for millennia. And she does that here. And then she says to mock us. Notice how she includes herself to try and get her servants' support behind her. Any idea what the word mock is? Yep, it's from our word Isaac again, okay? Okay, so then she also says that she cried out with a loud voice. Did she do that? Nope. So she just straight up lied there. So then the husband returns, and in verse 17, we have what she says to him. She spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. So it happened as I lifted up my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. Notice what she says here. He came, the servant, the Hebrew, whom you brought to us to mock me. That's the literal rendering of the Hebrew. What's different here in what she says to her husband as compared to what she said to the servants? Now, there's some similarities. There's also a difference.
Calls him the servant.
Sorry?
Calls him the servant.
Yeah, that's the big difference here. Notice when she's talking to the servants, she doesn't pull social rank and say, well, he's a slave. What could you expect? You know, she uses the race card instead. But here she uses both the race card and the status card to say, we've got this Hebrew servant, and you purposely brought him in here to mock me. You know, trying to put her husband on the defensive. I know why you brought him in here. You had this planned all along. You wanted to humiliate me. Well, it worked. Here's what happened. You know. So then we read that in verse 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. I didn't care for, I forget who read these verses. Didn't care for the translation there. Who read that? Was it, would you read your verse 19 again, Kristen?
It said Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her.
Okay, Potiphar was furious when he heard the story about how Joseph had treated her. Makes it sound like Potiphar is angry at what Joseph did to her. But if you look at another translation, and the King James is pretty good here, the New King James, about following the Hebrew order, what it says really is the master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused, but we're not told who he's angry at. Is he angry at Joseph, or is he angry maybe at his wife? And you say, well, that's silly. Why would he be angry at his wife? But what does he do with Joseph? Put him in prison. And if you found a slave messing around with your wife, and you're this powerful kind of man, what would you do to that slave? You'd kill them. Okay? Potiphar doesn't kill Joseph. Obviously, there's some suspicion here. He must know some things about his own wife. And he also knows that Joseph has been very trustworthy and very faithful. Okay? So rather than kill Joseph, he has to do something because he can't go against his wife's word. He has no proof otherwise. So he has to punish Joseph, but rather than the worst kind of punishment, it's a softer punishment by putting him in prison.
Is that maybe emphasized when it says it's in the place where the king's prisoners would come from?
Yes, and so then,
It's out of prison.
yeah, it's not just some dirty old dungeon that a peasant or a slave, a normal slave might be thrown into. It is actually a high-class prison, okay? And as it turns out, we're going to see that this prison is actually in Potiphar's own house. We find that out a little bit later in the story. So verse 20, probably Potiphar is angry because he has to give up his best servant, whom he trusts with everything, and he doesn't trust what his wife is telling him, but he has no choice to do what he does. All right, any other thoughts or questions on verses 11 through 20? Okay, so let's read the end of the chapter, 21 through 23.
But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper.
Okay, does any of this sound familiar to you? See a shaking of the head. Chris, what's familiar about it?
It sounds like it was in Potiphar's house as well.
Yeah, it sounds like the very beginning of the chapter. In fact, except for the fact that Joseph is now in prison instead of in Potiphar's house, it's almost identical. A lot of the words are the same. Verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. And we saw that back in verse 2. And here it says that he showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And we know that he gave Joseph favor in the sight of Potiphar. We're told in verse 22, the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners. And whatever they did there, it was his doing. Same thing that happened in the house, right? Potiphar committed everything into Joseph's hand, didn't worry about anything that was going on because he trusted Joseph. And then in verse 23, the keeper of the prison did not look into anything, literally again, that was under Joseph's hand, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. There's that word again, that idea of Joseph being a successful man. And I think that we are supposed to be shocked by these statements, because Joseph's life just seems to be getting worse and worse, and yet the story keeps insisting, no, Joseph is a successful man. He is prospering. The Lord's idea of success is so contrary to our ideas of success. Now, Joseph's dreams of ruling seem to clash pretty strongly with the reality of prison. And this raises for me an interesting question. I think as believers, even just as human beings, we all have hopes and we all have dreams. And if we're believers, we may also feel that some of those hopes and dreams have been directly given to us by God. Okay? But the question in the Joseph story is, Joseph's been given dreams by God. He believes that he is destined to at least rule over his family, if nothing else, to rule over them. But his earthly circumstances are so totally different. First of all, how can he rule over his family? His family's in Canaan and he's in Egypt. And he was a slave and now he's a prisoner. So this story talks to us about what happens when our dreams that we believe God has given us collide with the realities of life. And how will we respond? Will we be a Joseph who continues to just have the open hand, and whatever God places in those hands, he'll be faithful? God, you want me to be a slave? I'll be a faithful slave. I'll be the best slave I can be. God, you want me to be a prisoner? I'll be a faithful prisoner. I'll be the best prisoner I can be. You know, it's extraordinary, really. And rather than sitting and saying, oh, God gave me these dreams about ruling, and here I am rotting away in this stinking prison, doesn't seem to be Joseph's attitude at all. You know, so even though he seemed to start off a bit of a spoiled brat there in chapter 37, these experiences are molding Joseph and turning him into a better person than what he was. And I've found this to be true, not only in my life, but in life in general. When life is easy, we don't tend to grow as much. But when life is difficult, we can mature in a hurry. You know, there's something about difficulty and hard times that get rid of the rough edges, that sort out the things that really aren't important, and we start focusing on what really does matter. And God is certainly doing that here in Joseph's life. And once again, Joseph is getting the experience of what it's like to rule over a situation. He was the head servant in Potiphar's house. Now he's the keeper of everyone over the prisons, you know, under the authority of the prison keeper, but still, everything is put under his authority. So God is using these situations to prepare him for when this dream actually becomes a reality. And when the dream becomes a reality, it'll be fulfilled in more ways than Joseph could ever have imagined. His dream was about ruling over his family. He's going to rule over the most powerful nation on the earth. Okay. And God does that for us too, I think. He gives us these dreams, and we can become disillusioned when things aren't working out the way we think they should. But then God, you know, Paul says that God gives us abundantly more than what we could ever ask or think. And if it doesn't happen in this life, and it doesn't always for everybody, we know we have an incredible future ahead where what we will experience is beyond our wildest dreams. So, you know, something else that we know, and we obviously hear it being shouted loudly in this story, is that God's ways are not our ways. And it's in the prison that Joseph will meet those close to Pharaoh. Ironically, if Potiphar's wife hadn't tried to seduce him and then lied about him, Joseph wouldn't have been in the prison. If Joseph's not in the prison, he doesn't interpret the dreams of the guys there, who one of them later then tells Pharaoh about Joseph. So the prison is actually God's avenue of getting Joseph where he wants him to be. Not that God put him there. He was put there by the sin of Potiphar's wife. But once again, God is using what is evil for good in Joseph's life. And we've already emphasized then that Joseph is faithful no matter where he is. Do you guys have any thoughts about chapter 39? As I said, this is one of my favorite chapters in Genesis. It's very powerful, and there's a lot of life application, I think, here in this story.
I think it's just an interesting parallel with like Joseph's coats every single time. Like how it was first taken away by the brothers and now it's kind of taken away by Potiphar's wife. But then he's going to be like one day the second ruler of Egypt, and you know he would have like been given these pristine clothes that like would have made him stuck out.
Yes.
Like, it's just interesting. Everything's being taken away from him, but it's like one day it's going to be so much better.
Yeah, that's awesome, Kristen. In fact, we're gonna talk about that when we get into these next few chapters. But at this point, Joseph's clothes seem to keep getting him in a lot of trouble, right? His robe gets him in trouble. The garment that Potiphar's wife snatches off of him gets him in trouble. And so we're gonna follow up on that. That's a great observation, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, great. Anything else?
I love that last part you were just saying. Joseph had these promises from God that he was going to be this ruler, had these dreams, but didn't pan out at all the way he planned. That's just encouraging, especially as young people. Like, we have some cool ideas what we want to do with life, but I know in my life, whatever God has done, it's always been better than the plan that I had. And it's just cool to see that here.
Yeah, I think this is a great passage for young people because all of us, especially when we're young, but I think throughout life, we have dreams and hopes. And life takes twists and turns that we don't expect. I mean, this whole COVID thing has taken the whole world on a twist and turn that nobody expected. And yet, if we believe in a good God, we know that he's using this. You know, people have had to get married in different ways, and they haven't been able to graduate from school the way they have in the past. A lot of weird things have happened because of this. But if we believe in a good God, we believe that he can use these difficult, unpredicted situations in our life to do something in us that will make us even more fit for the kingdom and more useful in his service. So it's great. I know my life didn't take the turns that I thought it would take. I had my life all planned out, and God said, we're not going to go that direction. And yet he fulfilled my dreams, which is doing what I'm doing now. But it took a long time to get here to do that. Okay, so Genesis chapter 40, we read about two guys who end up in the prison with Joseph who have dreams. So verses 1 through 8. I think we're back to you, Blake.
Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker, cupbearer of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody of his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me."
Okay, thank you. So Pharaoh ends up being angry with a couple of his servants. Now, who would like the chief butler and the chief baker be? What positions are they actually holding in the court of Pharaoh? Maybe you have a different translation that helps in defining their positions.
Doesn't the cupbearer make sure they're not poison in the drinks?
Yeah, exactly. So, New King James says butler, you have cupbearer.
Cupbearer.
Yeah, so that's good because that lets you know what his job is. And his job is to test everything that Pharaoh would drink to make sure no one's going to poison it, right? And what about then the chief baker? What's it sound like? What would he be in charge of?
Cinnamon rolls all day.
Yeah, but really it means everything. He's in charge of Pharaoh's food. So he has the oversight of Pharaoh's diet. And therefore, he also is responsible for seeing that Pharaoh doesn't get poisoned by anything that he's fed. So the thought of many Bible scholars is that apparently a plot was uncovered to poison Pharaoh. And Pharaoh at this point doesn't know if the cupbearer or the baker are involved in it. So he puts them both in prison. And later we'll see, what happens to them. But we're told that they're put in custody, verse 3, in the house of the captain of the guard. Now, who's the captain of the guard? Potiphar. And we're told that it's in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. So here we learn that Potiphar put him in the prison that was in his own house. Okay. Potiphar's name isn't used here, but his title is given several times. So while they're there, they both have a dream. And in the morning, they're looking upset. Why are they upset over their dream?
They didn't understand it.
Okay. And yeah, they didn't understand it. And if they had been in Pharaoh's court, they would have had access to dream interpreters, right? People who specialize in those things. But Joseph says to them what? I love Joseph's statement.
Do not all interpretations belong to God?
Yeah. So you don't need someone who specializes in dream interpretations. God's able to interpret your dreams. So Joseph is pointing these guys here to God. And once again, we see him being a good witness. He was a good witness in Potiphar's house until the wife lied about him. And now he's witnessing to these guys in prison to trust God for the interpretation. So he asks them to tell him the dream. Okay, ready to move on? Yep. So 9 through 15, we get both the dreams and their interpretation.
Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of his house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon."
Okay, yeah, so I was wrong. This is just the first dream and its interpretation. So there's a prominent number that's going to actually occur in both of these dreams. What's that number? The number 3. We're told we're told that there were three branches, and that the 3 branches represent 3 days. There's actually a number of 3s in the dream. There's 3 branches. There's 3 verbs describing the growth of the vine. Pharaoh's mentioned 3 times. The cup is mentioned 3 times. The cupbearer performs 3 actions. And then we have the interpretation that the understanding here is that something's going to happen in 3 days. So what is going to happen to the cupbearer in 3 days? Okay, good news. He's going to get restored. And what is the language that Joseph uses here of his restoration? What does he say Pharaoh will do? Lift up your head. Do you remember when we had this story of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob was saying, perhaps he will lift up my face? So it's this idea of approving of someone. And here in the cupbearer's case, restoring him to his position. Okay. Now Joseph says, when this happens, do me a favor. Verse 14, remember me and show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh. And he says, get me out of this house. So here's where he calls the prison a house. So the jailhouse. And then for the first time that we read, he tells this guy a little bit of what he's been through. I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. And also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. Literally the word here is pit. So we had noticed that Joseph had been thrown into a pit by his brothers. He came down to a house of slavery, and now he's been thrown into another pit or house, which is the prison. Okay, any other thoughts? Right, so good news for this guy, not the same for the next guy, right? So let's read 16 through 23.
When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him.
So the baker's a little bit encouraged by the positive interpretation of the other guy's dream. So he says, okay, I'll go ahead and tell you mine. 3 is the number again, right? There's 3 white baskets on his head, and they're filled with all kinds of baked goods, and the birds ate them. So what's the significance of the birds eating the food out of the basket? No, it doesn't show that there's going to be a famine, because that's what Pharaoh's dreams will relate. But this is different. This particularly concerns the fate of the baker. Yeah, the birds are going to eat his flesh. Normally, in the ancient world, birds eating something is not always a good sign. It can be a very bad omen. I was just reading today, however, that one of the gods of the Egyptians was a falcon, and a picture of him eating something was supposed to be a positive sign. So maybe that's why the baker was like, well, this could be negative or it could be positive. Oh, well, this guy got a positive interpretation. Hopefully I will. But no, the birds eating the food are a symbol of the birds eating his flesh when he is put to death. Joseph uses the same language. What does he tell the baker? His head's going to be lifted up too, but in a different way, right off his shoulders. And then he says he will hang you on a tree and the birds will eat your flesh. That would kind of ruin your day. So 3 days later, sure enough, Pharaoh has a birthday party. Did you know they had birthdays in those days? Celebrated birthdays way back then. And the expression is used in verse 20. He lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. But of course, the lifting up of the head has two different meanings. And then the sad point in verse 23 is, yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So Joseph said, remember me. And we're told here in this verse, he did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So we think maybe this is Joseph's chance to get out of the prison, but sadly, it's not. And if you're Joseph, just think how you must feel. This is an opportunity, and you're left in prison and forgotten about. So life isn't getting easier at this point for Joseph. Okay, any other thoughts on chapter 40? All right, well, let's go ahead and take our break, and then we'll get into chapter 41. So Genesis chapter 41, finally some good news for Joseph in this chapter. And we begin with an account of Pharaoh's dreams in verses 1 through 8.
When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came out of the Nile and stood beside them in the river. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him.
Okay, so we're told at the beginning that at the end of 2 full years, so poor Joseph is just sitting in prison, and by that point you would figure, well, I've been totally forgotten about, right? But then God gives Pharaoh these dreams. So tell me a little bit about the dreams. What's the significance of things like the cows coming up out of the river, the cows themselves, the grain and all of that? Any thoughts?
Oh, we know what they represent just by the next chapter.
By the interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just wondering if you maybe knew of any type of significance, what these might mean for Egypt or Pharaoh or whatever. But let me put a few things up. For instance, the Nile was essential to Egypt's economy, and the cows come up out of the Nile. And both the fat ones and the sleek ones, or the gaunt ones. And so, since the Nile is connected with the whole idea of fertility in Egypt, there's a bit of a suggestion there that Pharaoh's dreams might have something to do with the fertility of the land. Also, cows were important to the agricultural economy, and they were actually a symbol of Egypt. And there's a word play in Hebrew on the word for cow and the word for Pharaoh. So the word for cows is parot, and the word for Pharaoh is paro. So Paro dreams about the parot. And then besides that, the grain was one of Egypt's main crops. Even up until the time of the Roman Empire, Egypt was known as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. The Egyptians shipped tons and tons and tons of grain to the city of Rome. So these are not insignificant items or random items that Pharaoh was dreaming about. when he dreams about the Nile and the cows and the heads of grain, these are all very significant in representing the economy of the Egyptians. All right. Okay, so I mean, most of us have probably heard this story in Sunday school, and there's no need to talk, I don't think, any further about what he dreams, because that's going to be rehearsed by Joseph along with the meaning. So you guys don't have anything else? We will move to the next section. So let's read a little bit of a long section here, verses 9 to 24.
Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my fault to this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night, day and night. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged me. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer in peace. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten, for they were just as ugly as the beginning. So I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me.
Okay, so with no one able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, obviously we have the hand of God involved in this. Finally, the cupbearer remembers Joseph, the guy who could interpret dreams. And he relates the story. He relates it pretty closely to the way things happened. And so Pharaoh says, let's get this guy. Let's see if he can interpret the dreams. So when Pharaoh sends for Joseph, what are we told? Verse 14. Given some details here. Mm-hmm. So why does he have to shave? He probably hasn't shaved in 2 years. Might look pretty grungy. Yeah, that would be one good reason.
I know the Egyptians were big to shave their heads and their faces.
Yes, they were. The Egyptians were clean-shaven people. So if you're going to stand before Pharaoh, you want to look proper. So this is probably another reason that that's mentioned. And then to go along with what Kristen had already talked to us about, Joseph changes his clothes. So he finally gets out of his prison duds and puts on some regular clothes to appear before Pharaoh. So we had said that one of the ways to track the progress of Joseph through the story was through what word? Talked about it earlier this evening. The word house, right? Another way to track Joseph's progress then is through his clothing, which is something that, as I said, Kristen mentioned to us. So we have the father's coat of many colors. And then we have Joseph in his slave clothes, which is what Potiphar's wife grabs. We have him now changing out of his prison clothes. And a few verses from now, we're going to see that Pharaoh dresses him in royal clothes. So those are two good things to know for the final. What two key words are used to trace the progress of Joseph through his story? Now, when Joseph comes before Pharaoh, Pharaoh says to him, I have this dream. No one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. How does Joseph respond?
I can't, but the Lord can.
Okay, I can't, but the Lord can. Verse 16, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I want you to think about that for a moment. You put yourself in Joseph's shoes, and you come highly recommended to Pharaoh that you're able to do something. This is your chance to get ahead. Yeah, I'm pretty good at this dream interpretation thing, so just lay the dream on me, and I'm sure I can handle it for you. No, none of that comes out of Joseph's mouth, does it? It's not in me, but God will provide Pharaoh an answer of peace. So a very humble response by Joseph. So Pharaoh relates the dream, and the dreams that he relates here very closely parallel the account that we read of them. Pharaoh adds a little commentary in. Like he said, these are the ugliest cows I've ever seen in my life. That's not told us in the original account, but everything is right in line with what we read earlier. A little different language at some points. Okay, so that gets us really to verse 24, and beginning with verse 25, of course, Joseph is going to offer the interpretation. So any questions or thoughts on these verses before we move on? No. Okay. So verses 25 through 40, Joseph's not only his interpretation, but his plan and his promotion.
Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward, there will be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours.
That's good news. So in verse 25, Joseph begins to interpret the dream, and he makes 4 points. I wonder if you can tell me what the points are that Joseph makes here about Pharaoh's dreams. Anything. Don't have to be in the order. I'm going to put them up here.
And like as far as the interpretation goes?
Yes.
But we have the 7 good years,
Yeah.
and we're at 7 bad years.
Right. So we got 7 years of plenty represented by the fat cows and the fat grain, and then 7 years of famine represented by the bad cows and the bad grain. What else?
Pharaoh's been merciful to him.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is very good of God to let Pharaoh know what's coming in the future so that he can prepare ahead of time. What else?
And then we have Joseph's advice, what he should do.
Okay, but even before we get to the advice, there's some other things that he tells Pharaoh about the meaning of the dreams.
That God brought it twice because it was established by God and shortly.
Okay, right. So he says, first of all, both dreams announce the same thing. Okay, he says that in verse 26. Verse 25. The dreams of Pharaoh are one. Okay, and that's why both the 7 fat cows and the 7 fat ears represent the same thing, and the 7 bad cows and the 7 bad ears. And so the number 7 obviously is prevalent and represents 7 years. So we have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Notice our number 7 again, popping up in Genesis. And then as Aoife said, the duplication of the dream means it is certain and God will quickly bring it to pass. Does this remind you of any other set of dreams that we've covered so far? Maybe give us some insight into the other dreams. Who else had 2 dreams? Jacob did. That's true. But they weren't close together, were they? They were separated by time.
Joseph, yeah.
So Joseph had 2 dreams. And now, as we hear Joseph's interpretation, we learn that his 2 dreams are the same thing. They're about ruling, which we kind of knew that. But we also find out that the duplication of the dreams means it is certain and that God will quickly bring it to pass. And guess what? Joseph is about to see his dreams fulfilled as he is raised up to second man in all of Egypt. So Joseph doesn't stop there. Without Pharaoh even asking him, he offers his advice. Here's what you need to do about this problem. So he's a man that takes charge, apparently. And what is it that Joseph suggests to be done?
To appoint the overseers.
Yeah. First of all, you need a guy in charge, right? And what kind of man does that person need to be?
Trustworthy.
Huh?
Trustworthy.
Well, he does need to be trustworthy for sure. How does Joseph word it here? A discerning and wise man. And at the end of this, Pharaoh's going to say, since God gave you the interpretation of the dream, there's no one as discerning and as wise as you. So he throws the words back to Joseph and says, you're the man for the job. So he suggests that, and then he suggests appointing officers or overseers. And what are they to do?
To gather up and store grain during the good years.
Okay, how much? 1/5. So during the 7 years of plenty, they're to set aside 1/5 of the produce in order to have it available then for the 7 years of famine. Okay. And he says that it should be stored up under the authority of Pharaoh and let them keep food in the cities. So in other words, spread it throughout the land of Egypt in the various cities, but kept under the authority of Pharaoh so that no one breaks into it. Because what is human what's the human, I can't think of the right word, reaction, I guess. When things are going really good, what do we sometimes do? When we got lots of something.
We use all of it.
We use all of it, right? Oh boy, we're in the money, or look at all this food we have, and we stuff our faces, or whatever it might be. And so Joseph is saying, when we have these 7 years of plenty, we need to be smart about what we do and store a certain amount. Save it for a rainy day, so to speak. Although there's not going to be any rain, it's going to be a famine. We're told in verse 37 that the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh recognizes, verse 38, the spirit of God, or maybe Pharaoh means the spirit of the gods, since he is a polytheist. But nonetheless, he sees the divine at work in Joseph. So once again, Joseph is being a good witness. And then he appoints him as a ruler. Okay. Questions or thoughts? So here's something that I found interesting, and that is a comparison between Joseph and Daniel. Has it ever occurred to you guys some of the similarities between these two? So I'm going to put up a bunch of similarities, and there's actually more than I could put on the slide. I didn't want to keep adding more and more and more to the slide, so this is a very impressive list. Number one, both were unwillingly taken captive to a foreign land. So in each of these, I'll give you the passage in Genesis and then the passage in Daniel. Number two, Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that no one else could interpret. So this is a way in both cases where God is able to pull his man forward and utilize him. Three, both kings have a troubled spirit because of their dreams. And this expression only occurs twice in the Old Testament. Here and in the story of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 3. Number four, Joseph and Daniel assert to their kings that only God can interpret dreams or mysteries. I think Daniel uses the word mysteries. Number five, both emphasize that the interpretation of the dream is accurate. Number six, Joseph and Daniel were both promoted to high positions within the court of these foreign kings. That's an obvious one that we probably all realized. Seven, both kings recognized God's presence with Joseph and Daniel using the expression Spirit of God. Just going to give you a couple more here. Number 8, both are said to be wise men. And then the last similarity that I have here, we don't have a passage on this last one, but it's obvious in both cases that both men were men of integrity. They could be trusted. They were faithful servants. Now, besides these, there's actually certain words, certain language that's used in the Joseph story that's also used in the story of Daniel. I didn't want to list those because I figured this is plenty to convince anyone that clearly Daniel and Joseph are being paralleled to one another here. So what can we learn from these similarities? What's the Bible trying to say here in these similarities? I'm not looking necessarily for anything super deep either. I'm just looking for a basic observation.
God doesn't care about social circumstances. He's able to do his work no matter what's going on.
Okay, yeah, God doesn't care about social circumstances. He can do his work no matter what's going on, who he's using. What else? Yeah, good things can come from bad times because Daniel is certainly experiencing bad times, isn't he? As well as Joseph. One of the things that I'm hoping we'll see, which story comes first? This is a dumb question. Story of Joseph or the story of Daniel? Story of Joseph. So what is the story of Daniel then doing by drawing these parallels? It's reminding us of Joseph. So yeah, it is. And so what does that tell us about Daniel?
Like similar attributes.
Yeah, so Daniel is actually a type of Joseph, isn't he? He's the very same kind of individual that Joseph is. So when you read the Daniel story, the Bible expects you to recall the Joseph story and to say, oh, we have another guy here who's like Joseph. And I'm sure you guys have pointed out some other things. I'm sure there's many more if we sat here and meditated on it that we could come up with. But I found this really fascinating, how many similarities there actually are. And like I told you, there's more than these 9, but this is enough to get the point across. Okay, any other thoughts before we move on? All right. So in verses 41 to 57, we read about Joseph's action and his rule.
And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, and laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands.
Okay, thank you for reading that nice long passage there. So Pharaoh says, "I've set you over all the land of Egypt." Verse 42, Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. So here we have Joseph being clothed by Pharaoh with royal clothes. And what is this position, do you guys know, that Joseph is being given? Yeah, he's called, it's sort of like a prime minister type position. The Egyptian word apparently, well, the word that we interpret as the Egyptian word, we would say is vizier, which would be similar then to a prime minister. Okay, so this appears to be the position that Joseph is given. So interestingly enough, Pharaoh gets Joseph a wife. And who is this lady? Potiphera. No, that's the father-in-law. Yeah. Yeah. Her name is Asenath. Yeah. By the way, this chapter has many original Egyptian words in it. And we can see it even in the names here that Joseph is given and his wife and so on. This is one of the things that also helps to authenticate the Joseph story. This isn't written by a guy 1,000 years later or something who doesn't know the culture and the customs and the language of Egypt. This is written by someone who knows what goes on in the court of Pharaoh and who knows Egyptian words and so on. So Moses is a great candidate as the one who may have composed this story. I mean, I'm sure it was told long before Moses, but perhaps then he's the one who copied it down. Anyway, so yeah, he's given an Egyptian wife. And she is the wife of a daughter who is a priest of a false god. It's all very interesting stuff. So Joseph has 2 children by her, which means that Ephraim and Manasseh are half Jewish and half Egyptian. And Judah's descendant Perez is half Jewish and half Canaanite. So the Israelite nation was never like completely pure blood from the family of Abraham. It included everyone who was a part of Abraham's household, all the servants that he had purchased and so on. And now his sons, his grandsons and great-grandsons, some of them are marrying outside the family bounds. And so these bloodlines are also becoming a part of the people of Israel. How old is Joseph when this happens to him? We're told. So he's 30 years old. And how old was he when he was in his father's house? 17. So we know then that all that Joseph has gone through has been over like a 13-year period. The time his brothers sold him, to the time he was in Potiphar's house, to the time he was in the prison, and until now. All right. So this is 13 years. And then we have the years of plenty. How many years is that? 7. So that gives us 20 years that Joseph is in Egypt at that point, right? And Joseph would be 37 years old. And then we're going to see when we get to chapter 42 tomorrow night that it's in the second year of the famine that the brothers come. So how many years has Joseph been in Egypt then? 22 years. How many years did we say were covered by chapter 38? Roughly 22 years, right? Okay. There's a couple of interesting similarities between Jacob and Joseph. These aren't perfect similarities, but nonetheless, Joseph was separated from his brothers for 22 years. Jacob was separated from his for 20. I think this next one's stretching it a little bit, but it's still kind of interesting. Jacob served Rachel for 7 years. Those are the feast years. And then he served for Leah 7 years. Those are the famine years. That's the way one Bible commentator puts it. Poor Leah. She always got the short end of the stick. Anyway, we might be able to see. Certainly the double numbers of 7, which equal 14 years, are true in the life of Jacob and Joseph here. And they're separated just about the same amount of time from their brothers. Okay, we've already mentioned that Joseph's position is that of vizier or prime minister. And we have records from Egypt that describe this position and people who occupied it and their responsibilities and that sort of thing. So that's helpful. So Joseph has 2 sons. Let's talk a little bit about them. What's the firstborn? What's his name? Manasseh. And what does Joseph give as a reason? Notice Joseph's the one naming the kids this time, not the wife, or they'd have been given Egyptian names probably. What is the reason that Joseph gives for naming his son Manasseh?
God has made me forget all my hardship in my father's house.
Yeah. So the name Manasseh comes from the root word to forget. And this is an interesting statement by Joseph. He's made me forget all my hardship or my toil and all my father's house. So life is good. God's given Joseph a new life. And basically he's saying he's been able to put the past behind him and all the terrible memories that he has from what was done to him. Then his second son, verse 52, Ephraim is born, and he says what about him?
God has made me faithful in the land of my affliction.
God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So the word Ephraim comes from the word to be fruitful. The same word that we've been reading throughout Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. Okay? Yeah, so Joseph here, now he's not simply looking back on the past as he did with Manasseh and saying, God's allowed me to forget that, but he's looking to the present and how abundantly God is blessing him and has allowed him to be fruitful. And so we read in verse 53 that the 7 years of plenty come to an end. Sorry, I should have put these guys up here. Okay. And then the 7 years of famine set in. And the Egyptians start running out of food. Pharaoh says, what? Go to Joseph. And what does Joseph do?
He sells them grain.
He does what?
He sells them grain.
Yeah, he sells them grain. So notice he doesn't just give it to them. He sells it to them. Why do you suppose he does that? If somebody gives you something, or if you buy it, you put a different worth on it maybe sometimes. At the beginning of the famine, the food would have been very plentiful because it was stored up in these storehouses. If it's just given away, perhaps people take more than they really need and they run out sooner. But if you have to buy it, you buy what you know you need and you eat it all before you go get more. So it's very wise stewardship in that way, but it's also wise. One of the things we'll see as we continue reading the story is that Joseph is a faithful servant of Pharaoh. And as such, he is serving Pharaoh and doing everything to be a blessing to Pharaoh's rule. And so Pharaoh has had to expend resources to build these silos and to store this grain. And now some of those resources are coming back to him as the grain's being sold. So we just see Joseph's faithfulness here in serving Pharaoh. Now, verse 57, I want us to notice. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. We've been tracing how the family of Abraham was told they'd be a blessing to all the nations. And either last night or the night before, we put up a map showing the various nations around Israel. Joseph goes down to Egypt now, and he's a blessing to the household of Potiphar. And here we have an explicit reference that he is a blessing to all of the nations round about, because they are all experiencing the famine. And thanks to Joseph, not only does his own family not need to starve, but all of these lands will be able to survive the famine. So God is indeed fulfilling that promise to use the descendants of Abraham to be a blessing to the nations. All right, I just have one more slide for you guys. I think it's an interesting thing at times to compare the first person in a book with the last person, be it a man or a woman. And so Joseph is really the last main character in the book. As we said, the other brothers are mentioned in the story, but Joseph is certainly one of the main focuses. And of course, Adam is the first. And so I think it's interesting just to look at things that are similar, things that are different. So God provided Adam with a wife and gave him dominion, just as Pharaoh does Joseph. Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife, and he gives him dominion over the land of Egypt. Now, what do you do when someone is this generous to you? Well, we just talked about the fact that Joseph served Pharaoh faithfully. Did Adam serve God faithfully? Not really, yeah. Adam acted out of self-interest, but Joseph did what was best for others. So there's an important contrast between Adam and Joseph. Adam was driven out of the land, out of the Garden of Eden. Joseph will lead his family into the best of the land of Egypt. So when we compare and contrast the first and the last man in Genesis, we see that Joseph actually stands above Adam as a better guy, doesn't he? Joseph stands above most people in the book of Genesis as a better guy. You know, when he was younger, he has his issues, and maybe Some would even argue the treatment of his brothers, which we're going to read about starting next week, that he's a little rough with them. But overall, Joseph is a pretty incredible person. And it's hard to find anyone better in the book of Genesis than Joseph. So this goes along with what I was saying about being a blessing to all the nations. The word all occurs 11 times in verses 47 to 57. And so it emphasizes both the extensiveness of the famine, but then also the extensiveness of the blessing that Joseph brings to all the nations. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so next week we'll pick up here with chapter 42. So God bless you guys. Have a good weekend. And see you next week.